to another disc guidance segment with the 2MK team. It was going to be a robotics lab segment, but we did manage just in time, that's why we're a little late. We did manage to review the general ways we've been seeing Gil played, basically the first order strategy because that's the important one, and found that our Gillbot is indeed functioning correctly. He's not a super hard character to understand, he's just a different form of Urian, and it turns out that the way they gave him his inputs make this relatively easy to do, to the point where we basically just did it the first try and it worked. But again, that has more to do with the simplicity of Gil's relative inputs than the usual genius involved in making these things. So we will be doing this in the usual disc guidance segment method, specifically explaining some things about the bot, what it's for and why it was made the way it was, showing off the bot itself in terms of inputs, talking about why it is helpful relative to things and relating it to the CPU so that you can see why we chose certain options and didn't use others, and therefore what you should use the CPU Gil for, and then doing full review of any variants, any options, and good ways to make it easier for yourself to train with the bot. We will be looking at a couple of characters, but because the bot is relatively simple, you should expect the stream itself to be just about an hour, maybe a little more. So let's get into that right now. We're turning on all of the settings at first, of course, and you're going to be watching Chun-Li for a bit. Gil does work with the usual max start for this type of bot. Zoners tend to get max start in similar things. The main purpose of our Gillbot is, of course, to try to make things, as much as you understand, relative to fighting someone's idea of how Gil should be played. All the high level we've seen so far is what you'd expect from this character. A lot of zoning, a lot of very precise movement, and a lot of standing in very precise spaces. And it was that particular use of him that turned out to be the best once we did just one modification, really. If you're not clear on it, Gil actually has no charge moves. His entire game plan is usually, at least in this type of game, based around zoning, and when he does choose to get close to you, it's more about you making a mistake or failing a confirm, and then he uses one of his very, very powerful combos. This is exactly how he works as a character and as a boss in other games as well. So it'll be familiar to people who have fought against him. Gil attempts to frustrate you into putting yourself in the wrong position, and then makes it impossible for you to actually get anything once you finally get there. Basically hoping that you mess up and flinch because of the amount of time you spend doing things. And while the bot is going to do his tackles a lot, a player doesn't have a good reason to do that. They can just keep on throwing projectiles at you basically indefinitely. In other forms, we've mostly made him relatively similar to Urian because they have similar, if not the same, normals in a lot of situations. I keep on feeling like I'm supposed to be able to throw that. The inputs for Gillbot are not that hard to do. In fact, he's one of the simpler ones. Similar to Urian. Urian is fairly simple, but Urian at least has charge moves. which makes it a little bit difficult to learn all the timings. Gil is basically inputting Urian, but without even that restriction or requirement. Which brings us to what the bot is therefore useful for. Urian was meant to teach you footsies. It seemed like a strange thing at the time, as if, how would you even get a bot that teaches you footsies? But it did somewhat work, at least. Gil does a similar thing in that he teaches you how to get to a particular position against a character where you must play footsies, but the character's goal is to zone you. This is similar to Falk, but Gil has a lot more traditional style zoning to do this with. And of course, with these armored moves, it's not exactly easy to just play the long game against him. One thing you should note, similar to how against Honda you have to do certain things, against Gil you have to be careful not to get too intimidated, because Gil does not do a lot of damage. In most situations, Gil's special abilities and debuffs are where you're going to get most of the stress in the match. But understanding spacings and knowing which buttons to hit relative to those spacings is an extremely important part of this matchup. With that said, therefore, let's go into the specifics of why he was made the way he was. Gil's moves are primarily about just the tackle, or rather the lariat, and the projectiles. He's not a terribly overwhelming character with all of his trickery. He does have a couple of good combos noted at close range, some light confirms into stuff, but you're not likely to be overwhelmed by his mediums, or even by that move. Mostly your aim is to be on point with your timing for your punishes, and you do have to learn them. And to get used to the idea that if you can get really good at recognizing when Gil has done something, you can hit him out of the something. But you have to be really on point for when he does the move. Otherwise, you will just end up blocking, and you just will have him in your face, which is something you really don't want a lot of the time. Which means you have to be able to do that type of footsies where you have to walk forward against a zoner who has a lot of control over the situation, but not a lot of random things he can do. So, let's start by going into what you need to do to actually input Gillbot. We do have some ideas for variants, and they are going to somewhat depend on your character. But today, there are not enough of the really strong variants that we need to think about that way. It's usually, are you holding this button or not? Are you hitting this button at this timing or not? That sort of thing is the main variant here. So, let's keep him quiet a little bit while we shift to showing off just one input at a time. As always, you should probably be able to just use these inputs directly, but we will have some extra explanation, and I do need to move to a point on the screen where you can actually see them properly. Yes, Gil, come closer. So, while the screen does get very bright now, you should be able to see on the right side some of the inputs for this part. Gillbot's input 1 is a little bit hard to see sometimes because of when he holds certain things, but overall, you are hitting a crouching V trigger followed by a medium punch. Hold the medium punch and then a back V trigger. At the end of that, a quarter circle forward, and that ends the input. What you should get is what you're seeing here. Pyro Lariat. So once again, down bat V trigger, down bat medium punch, hold that medium punch all the way to the end, back V trigger, and then half circle forward, and end the recording. This allows Gil to have his quarter circle forward and to do something else that will come up later relative to the medium punch being held. This is an edge shift, a special edge shift type that prevents the character from using the V skill because of something else later. Which brings us to action 2. Gillbot's action 2 is also relatively simple. It is a crouching light punch that follows after a V skill. So the V skill is first and just empty standing V skill. Then down bat light punch, down bat light kick, sorry, down bat medium kick. Hold that medium kick till the end. So you can see it here. If I stop him entirely, you will for a moment see him do V skill. Or rather, the input will be there. What normally happens when you hold the medium kick until the end is he will never do that again. The system will only see it as a medium punch and not a full V skill. And that allows us to have this result. There are, again, some variants here to make it a little more helpful in order to use EX moves. But this is not the best place to put that, as it involves hitting the V skill button and something else at the same time, and it changes a lot of the ways the bot works. So you can check that out on our website when we put the bot up. It's mainly for characters who have very advanced zoning options of their own, or such strength against projectiles that Gil's projectiles just don't intimidate them at all. Gillbot's action 3 is also simple. Basically, just a light punch and a medium punch and another. This one is the easiest one to change because it's not really for anything in particular other than to make sure that he can do this move. Because this move is so important to Gillbot, unless your character is again completely unfazed by light punch, i.e. the slow and horizontally traveling version of cryokinesis, you should still leave something like this in here. Now, the other thing that has gone into this input that is, again, mostly hidden and invisible is the fact that Gil actually is hitting heavy punch at the beginning of this. Meaning that technically, the first input here is heavy punch, light punch. You hold the heavy punch the entire time, and it causes it to loop in this form. If you don't manage to hold this heavy punch correctly from the very beginning of the input all the way through, he will do much more heavy punch related projectiles, and it causes it to go upward, and he will lose some of his ability to do EX things. He doesn't do a lot of EX things no matter what you do because of how we set up the system situation, but it's good to know anyway. Note that there's also a variant relative to action 1 that has to do with how long you hold the V trigger buttons at the end. But there is no specific requirement to hold them. It just changes, again, the behavior. This version, I believe, does have them held. No, it doesn't actually. Which is fine, because as you'd know, if you did hold them, it would change how he does, how often, and the way in which he does the Pyro Lariat. But holding the heavy punch all the way through action 3 is important. Moving on, therefore, to his action 4. Another extremely simple input. Down, back, throw. Down, medium kick. Quarter circle, back. This is technically also modifiable, but again, it comes down to how many of each input type you need in order for the bot to work. So we see here we have 2 different quarter circle back inputs. And technically, since that one is much more complicated, 2 different quarter circle forward inputs. His action 2, as partially mentioned, is a V skill, followed by a crouching light punch, a crouching medium kick, and basically a double quarter circle forward. Yes, a super motion. We want the CA in the bot for the most part. Even though we're not going to give him max meter to use it constantly, the way he uses his EX moves means that he can actually get there, unlike many of our other bots. And finally, his action 5 is relatively simple. It is a forward heavy kick plus light kick. Press up forward during the animation, and then press dash, basically forward forward. The timing for this can be a little tricky to learn how to do, because you are aiming to get it so that Gil is able to do this cross up, and that does mean you have to hold the heavy kick for the entire input. This helps it combine with other things and changes only 1 or 2 of his abilities actually, but it's still important enough to have that in here. If you would like a Gil that backdashes, please, and does less of certain things, please note that you will end up changing one of the other inputs. Do not change this input. This is a little bit odd because this is normally the input we leave specifically so you can change it. But what I mean is, more specifically, if you are changing an input in order to get a backdash, specifically a backdash, don't change this input. If you desire Gil to just jump less, or technically not at all because this is his only jump input, or you don't care if he dashes or not, then sure, change this input. But if you want to put a backdash in his rhythm, put it somewhere else. You must replace some other input. Personally, I would suggest changing, I believe it's action 4 in this case, because he doesn't need action 4 as much, especially if you're going to have him backdashing. So, from there, rather than explain how they all interact with each other, because it is relatively complicated and for once not specifically helpful, we are instead going to look at how Gil's CPU form works and why we didn't make the bot do specific things. The CPU has a very poor concept of how to zone on this character, and it's almost odd because most of the AI for zoning in this game on other characters is fairly good. If you really push yourself against most other characters that can zone you, you'll have a lot of trouble. But Gil seems to be more based around the fact that he can sometimes mess you up if you don't check his dashes. But since the CPU basically does a good job of simulating a player to a point in that he basically does nothing, and makes use of the fact that the CPU can read your inputs to deal with the fact that you can counterattack him, it's very difficult to get certain things done. You don't really learn as much as you need to or would need against the player. He throws fireballs occasionally and mostly doesn't do anything else. It's difficult to explain why this CPU isn't particularly effective at teaching you anything about the character. He more or less stands in the wrong place and utilizes the fact that the game can read your inputs to more or less hack the system. But if you think about, are you in danger from this character? The primary reason you're in danger from the CPU version of this character is that it has enough ability to read your inputs, not only to do that, but to know when to jump. This is not something we've observed as a really meaningful thing before within bots, or rather within the CPU. Normally, a character's jump arc or jump options are such that you can either do nothing, or you just always anti-air if you're really trained for it. Gil is odd in that his moves are complex. He can control some of the movement in the air, and that means that any action you take means that he can do things that he would not otherwise, or rather other characters would not be able to do. This is great as a boss's design, and isn't necessarily too unfair as a player. In fact, Gil is a good example of a character who was built to be a boss. He actually specifically uses and abuses the CPU's ability to read your movement, meaning that you don't have to do a whole lot of changes to him to make him reasonable as a character playable, as a character that is playable by players. Overall, he's still more or less balanced. You don't really have to care about the fact that he's a boss character, because he gets his boss powers from the idea that he's just going to stop you from doing things because he can see them coming. Therefore, the final result was, this isn't bad, but it's not necessarily teaching you much. There are definitely going to be some players out there whose mindset as to how to play the game really does approximate to this, but it's almost impossible for a player to have the level of speed and skill required to choose to do the things that he does in that space. And on top of that, he just doesn't do all that well at it. And that's even with him at level 8. At 7, he's not even as effective. Since he also generally won't do Lariat randomly, it's going to be difficult to learn to punish it. If you want to spend a lot of time learning to punish that move, well, I would say use the CPU, except that really, while you can obviously get good enough to do it, you more or less can't actually be sure. Because functionally, Gil doesn't actually do the moonsault knee if he doesn't think it's going to hit you. That may sound a little ridiculous, but it is a CPU and it does have a lot of methods to do that. He will jump, which doesn't make much more sense either. But you can see what I'm talking about here. If I set up a situation in which Gil is not seeing me take an action, he's just not going to do much. Which is fine if you want to practice fighting a Gil player that is very sedate and basically never makes any real mistakes because they don't commit hard enough to make any. But it doesn't teach you to punish most of the things he does, and you just end up getting comboed to death. And there's my demonstration for you. By doing instant head stomp on wake up, I've just caused the computer to do back heavy kick twice. I think that cements my point reasonably well. Gil depends, as a CPU character, on reading your inputs, so get used to the character first, or just don't use it. But now that brings us on to actually fighting and the point system. And for that, we're going to go over to having the actual playing be done by Kansuki Dynasty.
The time has arrived. Come.
Alright then, so let's discuss how this character teaches you things in the bot form and what we are using as the point system in order for him to be effective at that. So first we're obviously changing him back to bot mode. And we can put it so that he just starts immediately. Once again, he has maximum start on both meters, just so he gets a good head start and you don't have too much time of your own to get much. Ibuki is a good start for us because Ibuki's target combo starts with a light button and is very effective when your opponent ends up very close to you after you block. Which brings up the first thing we're talking about here. The main thing you do is block and punish his lariats. Now of course, as with most things that you start off with, the very first points in the point system, this is incredibly easy. Just block long enough and it'll happen. In fact, we would tell you outright you're doing yourself a disservice if you fight this bot and just block and do this, but that's true for nearly every bot. He can do some tricky things to eventually get a throw on you, and he can do a decent amount of chip damage. At the base level, this still tends to work because if he does go into projectile mode, and he can, and he actually throws enough of them from long range to hit you with them, he has a bunch of stuff that can eventually chip away your health while you work on perfecting your punishes. The other thing he will obviously do at least in this form, is that he will jump, at least some of the time. He doesn't do a lot of damage when he's jumping. We did not design him to do a lot of jump-based damage. It's not too hard to change him so that he does, and that is again a matter of changing action 4, I believe. He eventually becomes effective by way of using his V trigger, and therefore it is helpful if you give him V skill 1 so that he can, you know, build it up at least a little bit. If you're a very aggressive player, him having V skill 2 is usually fine. But at least consider it. When Gil is close enough, his medium projectiles do tend to hit characters, sometimes even crouching ones. So you don't necessarily have to worry about him not getting any effectiveness either. Whether or not Gil does his projectiles or his tackles is really completely random because of the way that Capcom decided to make his directions and buttons work. Basically that, well, just honestly you should just check it yourself. Quarter circle, forward, and back mean different things for different buttons, and it's just complicated. It's easy to memorize them as a whole, but because the moves end up seeming and feeling the same, the idea behind them is different. Overall though, you can have a timing where he just does almost constant tackles for a round, and then other times where he basically just doesn't do it at all, because it just depends on which of the inputs we use randomly comes out, and we basically cannot change that. As in, the game doesn't, the way his inputs are designed, there's no way to make it so he does one more than the other. What you could do is take away an entire move so that he is missing one, and then that would change the chances of any given thing. But if you do have him using both Pyro and Cryo Lariat, Pyro and Cryokinesis, then you will get those times where he just spams one or the other for a long time. The only main thing having an input there is that when he does do the kick version for forward, he's slightly less likely to do it because he does do the moonsault instead. Also not something that's easy to fix. Now, back to talking about what precisely you want to do about this. As with all first points, you eventually just stop getting the points. The medium difficulty of any bot is, okay, you learn that the big punish you're supposed to know to get through with this character so that you don't just get your opponent doing things annoying to you constantly. Now, learn the rest of the matchup. So, that rest of matchup is fairly simple. Stop that move. Gil will do moonsault occasionally, but when we say stop, we don't mean wait till Gil misses and do something. Because players are not going to miss anywhere near as much as the bot does. Bots, obviously, do this type of move where he has to manually control it with relatively random targeting. Sometimes it's really great, and sometimes it's not. But it's also the type of move where you need to be ready to deal with Gil doing it really early for the exact same reason, actually. If you think to yourself that you can ignore this move because the bot does not generally aim to hit you, when you face a player, you will die. Similarly, if you come to the conclusion that you must punish this move every time, but you're going to wait for it to land, a player will do similar things, go over your head, fake you out, and then hit you from the other side, especially if you had a fairly heavy commit on whatever it was you needed to do to stop it. Basically what we're saying is that, like our Clawbot, it's almost valid to consider that you need to be able to figure out how to respond to Gil even though he's not actually trying to hit you. Because you don't want to get too caught up in one response type or the other. And for most characters, it is better to be proactive and defeat Gil before he even comes down than to wait for him to land and hope you get something. But because you have to then make a choice decision, as we call it, you will find yourself occasionally reacting too slowly to things that Gil does. The third point system is actually different depending on whether or not Gil is in V trigger 1 or 2. Even though it's going to seem a little weird because only one of them is actually related to the V trigger. If Gil is in V trigger 2, when he does that stomp to put the ice on the ground, most characters can actually not only stop Gil from doing this, but punish him relatively heavily for trying, meaning that while players will not necessarily do this that often in those places, you know people eventually get stressed out, they eventually misspace themselves. You have to be ready to not let him just do this move and put the ice in front of you. To see that you have the opportunity to hit him before he can do it. Like literally see the startup of that particular move and stop him. So you do in fact get a point for stopping Gil from doing that ice stomp altogether. But whether or not Gil does this is almost entirely random as well. He's a fairly well designed bot in terms of his randomness level. Meaning that this point is very hard to get. It is a little bit easier from the other side, so let's change him to V trigger 1. And look into what we're trying to do there. Note that Gil's V skill 1 changes element depending on which V trigger you choose. If you choose V trigger 1, Gil's V skill 1 is a fire attack. And if you choose V trigger 2, it is an ice attack. This does matter because of the two separate effects that the ice and fire have, but that's a Gil question, not a bot question. You can decide what you want to train against. With this particular version, therefore, when Gil has V trigger 1, his positioning against the player changes somewhat. And we've learned that his positioning changes in a very useful way. Specifically, he can no longer easily push you out to the point where the zoning is easy. He gains the potential to hit with a projectile from a range close enough where you can punish it. But, as you've just seen, you can't necessarily respond to what looks like a projectile this way.
Time to return to harmony. Seraphic wing! Useless. Submerge. Submerge.
You still get your other points.
Now burn. Smite.
And technically it doesn't matter as much if he sends it over your head or not.
Can you endure the pain?
The reason for this is that, like most projectiles, at the range that Gil does it, the range he's doing it at is far more important than your specific reaction. In other words, Gil's projectile is punishable.
Can you endure the pain or just die? Meteor strike.
So the fact that the Gillbot doesn't necessarily always do the perfect one isn't really that much of an issue. Just punish it. It doesn't matter if you did it over your head. React as quickly as you can to the idea and the fact that Gil threw a projectile while close to you. And that's all you need to know. It is better if you do it with a normal that is actually capable of both reaching him and punishing him, which for most people is a medium. For like Geef and Alice, I think it is light only. The V-trigger itself is not that relevant to the whole prospect. He's not going to give you a lot of opportunities to do this. But it's definitely going to be enough of them that you could reasonably get some points out of it. As we mentioned before, there are variants that will cause him to throw more projectiles, especially lateral ones, because we do have some control over that with the edge shift aspect of it. But it's not as necessary, and we're down to the final point system part, which is the definition of why it's not as necessary. For this though, we're going to have a change to Sakura. But we are going to leave Gil on the same V skill and V trigger for now, while we demonstrate the Sakura part. Against Urien, we had a very difficult point requirement in point B. A punish, basically. A whiff punish of an extremely hard to whiff punish button.
The time has arrived.
Because Urien's crouch medium kick is almost unwhiff. It basically can't be whiff punished by most people, but the point was never to actually whiff punish the button. You eventually could definitely get good enough to do it, but we're still not sure if for some people or some characters that was prediction / guessing style rather than the other style. However, Gil's medium kick is a lot more whiff punishable in terms of raw, I saw this thing, can you do it? It does get a little odd because Gil is, you know, taking advantage of the 3D-ness of the game and uses technically two different animations because he always does the medium kick with the ice leg. So depending on which side of the screen he's on, you have to recognize two different animations. But that part's not as important. The main thing is, this move is whiff punishable, but the bigger problem is, playing footsies with Gil in a way that lets you get close enough to him is hard. Moving forward is always dangerous, because you get lariated a lot. You can give him his space, but eventually he will do something about this. And while, again, you can absolutely do your punishes, in Sakura's case it's a little bit harder, but, you know, still worth practicing light kick into Shoken. But the overall thing we're getting at here is, this is hard enough to do, and Gil does not necessarily stick out that medium kick so often that you can easily get the points. If he comes to you, fine. Poke him back off. Do what you're supposed to do so that he doesn't stick to you. But you can see already that the range Gil stands at and the tools Gil has means that walking forward into the point where you can crouch medium kick him is hard. And max range crouch mediums, it doesn't have to be kick, on nearly everyone in the game are hard to confirm into anything really good. With Chun-Li being the main character that can do anything. But you do have to play footsies with this character one way or another. And he is good at whiff punishing you. Not to mention all his other tools for making just being in that space necessary but difficult. So, once again, we have an Illuminati character where your goal needs to be to get to a particular spot, more so than to spend a lot of time punishing something. If you don't manage to get to a spot where Gil can make a mistake, then he simply won't, and you will lose by timeout or chip damage or something, because Gil is not really required to make mistakes as part of his game plan. He doesn't have to take any risks to be an effective character. He is also, of course, good for practicing your 3-frame punishes, similar to how Guile can be. But overall, he will put you back enough that your next thought being, okay, I'm supposed to not be so close to this character because he'll hurt me. With hit confirms, good frame traps, a lot of control in the sense of him putting me where he wants me. But you also can't be too far away because then you can't hurt him. You have to be at a very specific spot, and all the moving around to get to and stay in that spot turns out to be difficult when he can just suddenly do full screen charging moves. Not charge moves, but he does charge the entire screen if you let him. If you jump over his lariat, you'll notice immediately that he goes flying to the other side of the screen. So, sort of a combination between Ryubot, Boxerbot, and Urianbot, but with mostly Urianbot's goals. Fortunately, he doesn't confirm that well either, and as we mentioned before, Gil just doesn't do a lot of damage. In fact, part of how this works is awareness and skill on the part of the player playing Gil to recognize what state they have put you in and go for the combo that leads to retribution. Because retribution is how Gil gets a lot more damage.
Time to return to harmony.
And converts so strongly from one thing to another. The other thing you are seeing, you just saw, is that even the bot, despite it having multiple inputs that can be EX, has been designed such that mostly he won't use the EX moves constantly. He won't often build up to full meter, but if he's lucky, let's say, he'll have enough time to build up quite a lot of meter. You can already see it here because he does get some EX meter when he does his V-trigger moves. And because he has so many moves with long animations, he's less likely to use up his meter at an extreme rate. Or at least by our standards. By our standards, having a bot that does use meter or has the capacity to use meter this often, but is often at 1 bar, is a bot that doesn't really abuse their meter usage. If you would like to continue having something to do with the lariat rather than just stand there and then try to punish it, as just noted, there is actually a very tiny window before Gil reaches you where you can stop his lariats. In the same sense, you know, you can punch Honda headbutt or similar. Personally, I'm still obsessed with the idea that at some point I may be able to throw this move just on 1 frame, but I don't suggest you actually investigate this. It's just a matter of understanding that overall, if you are fairly far out, you can stop certain things Gil does if you've come across a player that for some reason wants to take a risk to chase you down. If you are willing to have a contest of who can play more lame, you have some options when it comes to dealing with Gil's lariats that you may not have otherwise. So you can practice those against the bot as well. Feel free to look into the anti-air thing more as well. Or depending on how difficult you find it to be for your character, just consider the anti-air points part of the knee points. Because he does generally, if you've input him well, he doesn't jump so often that you would just get a ton of points from this. He's similar to our Edbot, where you have a ton of other things to focus on, but then he sometimes jumps on top of that. Relatively close to how a player might do it, because most players who play characters like Gil and are willing to zone for long periods are also not very jumpy. But just like Urien, your overall goal should be to remember you won't get the proper experience from this bot without aiming to get to that spot where you can hit with your crouching button. Now, many characters do have a better standing button they can use. And while we don't necessarily discourage this, most of the time these standing buttons will put you into a battle of attrition with Gil. Let's look at that from the perspective of hitting with Sakura's stand medium kick, before we take one quick look at Karin and end. Getting back to the same position, or rather a slightly easier position because it's easier to do it, is not so bad. But the fact that you're standing and that you're sticking a button into a space that Gil will attack with multiple methods means that you shouldn't worry too much about this. It's not a strong game plan against the character overall. He has too many relatively good buttons for with punishing that Urien actually does not share. But more importantly, it simply comes down to the fact that Gil is more effective in confirming in footsies because he doesn't use charge moves. So he can change range a lot more easily than Urian can and get the same benefit as if he had to worry about something else altogether. His V trigger and V skill also are generally more effective related to these things. Mainly because they don't involve standing there for a good 55 frames armoring up. If you think you can win the battle of attrition with Gil and you want to train yourself to do that, let's look at how that looks actually after this.
Time to return to harmony.
We will have Kansuki Dynasty return to Karin, and we will take off all of her limiters on her aim because she's the type that would actually play this matchup naturally and do a lot of different things. So if we take out at least the please don't completely overwhelm the bot with your offense and move back to at least keeping in mind the goal of get to the right place and play some form of footsies. You will get to see the overall behavior that Gil has when faced with a character who can just hit stand medium punch or stand medium kick, or in Karin's case stand heavy punch, and just be fine. Note again, this is really not a way to train in terms of the bot point system or understanding much there, but in terms of being able to use it for something like a kata, you can still learn some things. With the current inputs, Gillbot is just often enough that you have to question your methods. So as you can see, he's not terribly effective. But if you think and look at the amount of time spent sitting quietly near this character as a result of this, you would realize that a person who chose to try to escape in those moments would generally be managed to do it. Which is a big deal when it comes to a zoning character like this. Because he's relatively easy to chase down if he chooses to run away a lot, but he's not so easy to chase if he mostly holds his ground and then gets away when he thinks that his offense is over, but you're not confident in that. It's one of the stronger methods for a character like this to exist in. Intimidating you into thinking that it's his turn, but knowing, okay, if I try something, my opponent might freak out, they might do something I don't want them to do, and then I will take some damage, so I'm just going to get away. Most of the time, you're not going to react to chasing this character down in time. But if you react at all, and you let him block, because he has strong controlling punishes from even things like 4 frame, you're not going to get a lot of advantage. Even relatively safe specials, if they put you too close to Gil, mean that he has advantage. But But let's make one more change, because his V skill in this space is actually a lot less effective than it would seem, even though he is not doing nothing. It does have to be considered. So we're going to put him back to V trigger and V skill 2 for this final part of it, and demonstrate what happens when you do that, with the intention to just play this type of footsies with him. Remember, even though she could keep up pressure, a lot of the goal here is for her to get to that space and fight from there, which is why you will see her get moving back to this spot to give Gil space. Now, while Gil is just charging lariat-wise, just punish him off. After that, though, he will eventually stop, and you have to deal with everything else he can do. And at that point it starts to get somewhat interesting, at least. Because in this state, he has the capacity to push you off him, and if you are keeping with the same mentality, getting back into position can be hard. This is basically, therefore, what we are talking about. You can get to the point where you need to do a very difficult confirm in order to get any damage on Gil that isn't just poking him to death. Because as mentioned, she could just use her stand medium kick in a lot of situations, and everything would be fine. And if your character is the type that will actually emerge victorious against Gil by poking him to death with their stand medium kick, we're definitely not saying, hey, don't do that. Just do remember that he does have armored tackles. And eventually, because he does have a lot of moves that, while they are not advantaged, they're strong and not particularly punishable. He's going to be one of those fishing for crush counters in neutral type characters. If you start to fight him that way, that's what is going to happen. More importantly, if he manages to land anything, let's say he puts you on fire and then manages to land his stand heavy kick, now you've been hit by retribution, and from there, just things happen is the best way to put it. If you don't understand what I mean, just watch any Gil combo video online. They're not usually too big, but they are enough to make you think that you probably should not let him hit you with them. So you have an example there. And again, bear in mind that Gil actually has status effects on these hits. Your fire state does not allow you to regenerate any white health, so he can just go full on chip mode. With normals, just poke at you with normals indefinitely, more or less. And when you are frosted, you don't recover any stun gauge, meaning that he eventually will manage to get the stun if he can manage to land that status. Or even if he doesn't, he just puts you at constant higher risk of it. Now obviously, you can just hit him to remove these, meaning that the stand medium kick option is a good option, but you do have to be careful, because he can get retribution on a lot of things, including jumping attacks. It's not as useful to get retribution on a jumping attack, but there are definitely still some benefits. So in terms of the bot, we've made our best effort to make it so that you occasionally get hit by retribution. This has a lot more to do with the potential oppressiveness of a player and their concept of focus than anything else, which is hard to recreate in a bot scenario. Meaning that the final way to think of it is, if you wanted to face a form of Gil where you got to hit those buttons, you might need to find space to give Gil his backdash. Or maybe even a back jump. Whatever annoys your character the most, honestly. Especially if it annoys your character but you have a chase or a way of dealing with it. That's one of the most helpful ways to do it. But with that retribution hit, we've come to the end of our stream. Again, this was going to be a robotics lab, but given the combination of the simplicity of the character and our instincts in how to do this, we're now considering this functional Gillbot, so you can feel free to use these inputs. You will find them on Sunday when we release the bot on our on our website 2-mk.org, and we will announce when Gillbot is released on Sunday. Should be around 7 Eastern. On our Twitter 2_mk_FGC. So look out next week for more content relative to Street Fighter V. Specifically, we will almost certainly be having our Mishmashing Battle Lounge on Monday, and another round of the bot checkup on Wednesday. Since we do not seem to need to develop a specific fire and ice version for Gillbot, at least not yet, and we have a gap between now and the release of Seth, we will also use next Friday for the other part of the bot checkup as well, meaning that we can do that in 2 weeks. And yes, we are streaming despite the fact that it is Christmas and then New Year's. So while you are not necessarily going to be watching at that point, it's a good time to get that sort of thing done so that you can check it out on our YouTube channel later and get all of the details. There is a chance that the Christmas Day stream will be with someone else, and of course, due to the fact that there are going to be less people available to do it, if anything does come up, that's the one that's the most likely to not happen. But you can still look out for it and expect the usual type of content from us in the coming weeks. We will not necessarily be taking our usual end of year hiatus. More so, in fact, after that. Meaning that after New Year's, between January the 4th-ish and February 20th, when all of the mini games come out, or just before that, that's when we're likely to have less streams. So don't be surprised if you don't even necessarily get tweets during that time, as we're probably going to be busy preparing all sorts of things. So with our boss character finally complete, that brings us to the end of this year's Street Fighter V bots. And you can join us just for the checkups. We hope you're enjoying the new Champion Edition with crazy V-skills everywhere. Why did they give Guile a jumping Sonic Boom? But this has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone.